Hi, this is Alex Rothermel, or Raspberries 2006 from PB Nation, coming with a best possible LPR for your G6R video with a design of experiments that was used to get there. And the genesis of this video really came from me and Nick Valeka talking he was kind of talking smack at me for my spreadsheet and my really high tunes, as he was calling it, because while my spreadsheet works, I can show up to the field and chrono once and I'll know exactly what pressures I need to set to get to right at 290. My pressures are significantly higher than just about any gun that Nick comes out with. And, we were talking about it and we kind of noticed that I was always using this die tip and salty fang, kind of the lightest possible config that you could use. And he mentioned that he had been kind of focusing more on the pins, the old school flat pins, and we talked about rammer weights and we talked about some other things. So it made me commit to doing a design of experiments, a DOE, to figure out what's the best practice to get to low LPR? Because you want to have the lowest LPR possible to be as as soft as you can on paint. And the max FPS on a G6R really is governed by its LPR. If you go over 100 or 105, depending upon your solenoid, you risk blowing your solenoid and then it'll never go above 230. So that is the big key consideration for why we are so focused on getting the lowest LPR possible per an effective tune. But before we get into all of the data and all the results, there's some caveats we got to go through, and kind of the purpose of the video is how to tune for the lowest possible LPR for the G6R is question number one. And in doing so, how do we achieve the gentlest on paint shot possible? And some limitations as we're talking about this particular Ripper with standard front bastard Ripper marker. This is a limited sample size. Nick's going to do some of his own testing, but this is my one gun and this is my test platform. And if you've had a ton of anodizing, your pressures are going to be different. If you have like different production runs are tighter or smaller in certain bores, and bolts, poppets, weights, uh, a lot of things matter in the total output of a G6R. And then the biggest, largest variation is how round your paintball is. Some of these Eglins Best are not very good going through a G6R. So before I could even really get into the DOE, I had to really science out what was the best rammer O-ring for my G6R. Now, I really want to point out that this really is marker specific. You cannot look at my chart here and pick the best rammer O-ring for your G6R, because your G6R is not mine. I polished mine by hand and mine is actually tighter than most, and my particular best rammer O-ring is a 1.8 by 7.5 millimeter 70 durometer O-ring. Uh, Stock seemed to be worst. Nick told me that he basically always uses this 1.9 by 7.2 millimeter 70 durometer O-ring. And the other funny thing is back in the day, Bob put Dow 55 on all of these and they all swelled. So you got to figure this out for yourself, because it depends on where, number of anodized strip cycles, and what production run you did. And yeah, so I picked the 1.8.7.5 because it was 5 FPS better than the nearest competitor. So taking a look at the factors within the design of experiments, I landed on four variables with 2 for LPR, 3 for dwell, 2 for bolt weight, and 2 for poppet. Now, I want to point something out here. So I showed earlier that the lightest possible bolt configuration that I had been using, which was die tip and salty fang, which is actually like one of the most common ones, was right at 29 point, whatever grams. Sorry, it's right here. 26.7 grams. And when you do the math, right about 10% is the difference between the two different weights. And where does this 30.207 come from? Well, I took an F1 tip and a old school, this is a blackout pin, and these steel pins are significantly heavier than any of the pull tabs that we can put on one of these method bolts. So this 30.197 really is representative of the old school pillow bolts that, they had the bob long with the brass pillow tip, and they had the pin that was proud and sticking out the top, and the larger screw, and the ball bearing and the spring. So this weight is about the closest that I could get shaving and trimming off of this little fishing lead weight here, plus a die tip because I didn't want the flow to affect the variables in this testing. And then to kind of rattle off the constants, use a stock rammer. The HBR PSI never changed. As I mentioned, the die tip, 1.8 by 7.5 millimeter rammer O-ring, 6.682 BL bob long barrel, and all testing was done on the same case of paint. So taking a quick peek at the results, want to explain my codes here. So anything starting in LP is an LP poppet. Anything starting in CO is a Corrado poppet. 64 means it was 65 LPR PSI and 4.0 dwell. 74 means it was 75 LPR PSI and 4.0 dwell. So here's the code. And then at the very end, there's heavy or light, which is 26.7 or 30.207. And the example of the code is LP77H is an LP poppet at 75 LPR PSI and a dwell of 7 with a heavy bolt. So the very best performing in the screening DOE, which is looking at all of these runs, which there was 25 runs in total, was the LP poppet at 75 LPR and 7 dwell in the heavy configuration. And what's also interesting is the very worst was the Corrado poppet at 65 LPR, 4 dwell light. So without looking at the next chart, all the 65 LPRs are at the bottom. All of the 75s are basically at the top because LPR is the most important factor, but we're optimizing for it. And then it really comes down to weight. And then it's really hard to identify a pattern with dwell. It almost doesn't matter, except that low weight, low dwell, low LPR equals the worst possible result. So I kind of talked through it already, but here's all the runs kind of charted. And this dividing line in the center, just for my sanity, I did all the LP poppets first, and then I did all the Corrado poppets second. And we have the low weight, low LPR LP poppets all performing at the bottom, and that's mirrored for the Corrado poppets. If you have low LPR and low weight, it does not do well. But even when you have low LPR, but you have a heavy bolt, these groups showed signs of life and improvement. And you can kind of see like the tuning curve here, and you can see the turning curve here, and then kind of flatten out. But all of these groups here had a heavy tail config. So the point of the screening DOE was to take a look at the kind of the best, the second best, and the absolute worst results and challenge them 30 versus 30 with a statistical sample size to and trying to get a p-value to prove out that it is better or worse or whatever having a weight. Now, when it came to Corrado Poppet, 75 LPR, and 4 dwell with the heavy versus the light, we did not get a difference in FPS, but what we really got is a huge difference in consistency. The heavy was same average, but these pluses or minuses, it was plus or minus 4 versus plus or minus 8. This huge difference here, and you're going to see that pattern repeated across the next one. So even though not a statistically significant increase because of being a high LPR going against a really light poppet, much more consistent. And then taking a look at the same Corrado poppet, the same light poppet, but going forward dwell, 65 LPR, we see that there was a statistically significant increase in shot PSI, 250 versus 244. This is just a 3 gram fishing weight basically that is adding this difference. There's no other changes, and it makes you get 5 FPS. And that's just getting back to what we used to have with the OG bolts. The final enhanced trial was the LP poppet with 75 LPR and 7 dwell heavy versus light, and we saw both a tighter spread and a statistically significant increase just by, like I said, including that 3 gram fishing weight plus the larger high rise tail. And this is a good lane. This is getting snake players off the rip. This is not a good lane. So let's conclude this video. All of the differences, statistical significant or not, have come from essentially putting a little lead weight right here. The weights between these two tails are not that different. There's a little more weight to this aluminum versus that aluminum, but it's really all just coming from here. And that just gets us, because I trimmed it and made it match what that kind of OG bolt weight was. But this kit that Nick and I are talking about coming out with, here is the possible pretty close calculated weights that they would be. The F1 tip would go from 3.109 to 10.259. The die tip would go from 2.19 to 7.227. And the fang tab would go from 2.812 to 9.280. So if you wanted to be conservative and just get to OG bolt weight, you could have a bolt that weighs 31.28 grams just by using the copper die tip and then your normal salty fang that you've got anodized to match your gun. And it would look good. You would get a little bump in your FPS. You wouldn't be crazy out of tune. You'd be just like the old days. Or you can go nuts and do an F1 tip and probably the thumb drive, but I have the fang copper here counted. You could run both copper parts, and who knows what that LPR PSI could be with that heavy of basically the equivalent of a dart kit with a full 40 gram heavy bolt. So that's kind of it. That's the conclusion. It makes a difference. It counted in the DOE. It's statistically significant. I'm going to have one. I might have two. And these videos always have, obligatory shooting video. If you're only into watching the data, you can click off now, but this is just me kind of getting a real life example of it. This is more anecdotal, but here, let's just watch.
G6r with this green LPR, it's green for a reason, is set to 65 LPR and HPR's 205. You would never want to run 205 over 65, especially not in this weather. But what I'm essentially showing is weight makes a huge difference. So we're gonna do it on camera. Here's the salty fang, and it's pretty light. It's one of the lightest you can do. And then here's the salty high-rise one with a piece of lead in it. Now I'm going to show this on video. You can see some of my prior shots, like this thing 230s, like classic, like undertuned. And then what you'll see is I'll switch this over and I hopefully won't drop the piece down and it'll wake right up. Watch this. .258. So for FPS there, we had a max of 276 and 240 with the heavy. I think I'm going to go ahead and try and switch it back and do a string just like that. So back to the light one. Okay, that shows it. That got it on camera. So with the heavy with the heavy bolt weight, we had a max of 270 and a low of 240 some. And then here with this light one, we have a max of 236 and a min of 239 or 209. Let me zoom in on that. Okay.
So that's the video. Hope you get a kit. Thanks for watching.